The readings are from the book of Judges and the book of Ruth. First reading is from the book of Judges, chapter 1, verse 1 to 3. Now after the death of Joshua it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, Who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Indeed, I have delivered the land into his hand. So Judah said to Simeon his brother, Come up with me to my allotted territory, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I will likewise go with you to your allotted territory. And Simeon went with him. The second reading from Judges 21, verse 23 to 25. And the children of Benjamin did so. They took enough wives for their number from those who danced, whom they caught. Then they went and returned to their inheritance, and they built the cities and dwelt in them. So the children of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family. They went out from there, every man to his inheritance. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And Ruth, the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 1 to 5. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there among about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. In chapter 4, verse 13 to 22. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on the bosom and became a nurse to him. Also the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, There is a son born to Naomi. And they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron, Hezron begot Ram, Ram begot Aminadab, Aminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon, and Salmon begot Boaz, and Boaz begot Obed, and Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. Amen. Holy Father, sanctify us in the truth, thy word is truth. Amen. Grace be to you, and peace from God our Father and from the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. We've reached the books of Judges and the book of Ruth. The background is Joshua's and the Israelites taking of the land of Canaan. We learned last Sunday in the book of Joshua how Caleb and the tribe of Judah were faithful, and they took their allotted territory. We also learned that some of the other tribes did not take all of their territory and were not as faithful. We learned about how the people of Ephraim and Manasseh did not fully trust God, and therefore did not take their allotted territory. And we also learn especially from Joshua's speeches and the renewal of the covenant, how idolatry has already been creeping into the hearts of the Israelites. Now we reach the book of Judges, which describes the period after the death of Joshua. And we see a beginning decline of Israel. They had received all these promises. They had received the Holy Land. God had been with them. He had shown them wonders both when they left Egypt and when they went into the Holy Land and started conquering the Canaanites. But nevertheless, after Joshua has died and the first generation has died, a decline begins. The first part of the book of Judges is an introduction that is really in two parts. There is a political perspective, or the perspective of Israel on how this decline began, and then there is the spiritual or theological perspective, the perspective from God's eyes on how this decline began. But they both deal with the same time period. And the first is the political introduction, which is from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 2, verse 5. And it begins with the Lord sending the tribe of Judah to attack the Canaanites. And Judah brings Simeon with them and attack the Canaanites. They win the first battle, but already here we can see that they do not execute the Canaanite king Adonibezek as they have been ordered to do. Instead, they follow a Canaanite custom and cut off the thumbs and the big toes like the Canaanites do. They capture a number of other cities, but only one of them is put under the ban, Hormah, in chapter 1, verse 17. So we see already here that some disobedience to the commandment of the Lord. Now, the Lord had commanded that they were to punish the Canaanites with death for their idolatry and their sinful acts. And we can remember especially the acts of Sodom and Gomorrah, which were Canaanite cities, and the same things were probably happening in other cities, and plus child sacrifice and other things. And therefore Israel were to punish them. So they were really an instrument of punishment for God against the Canaanites, and therefore they were not to spare them. But they saw this as a human conquering, where they were to take what they needed and not as a punishment of God. Also, the tribe of Benjamin fails to drive the Jebusites out of Jerusalem in chapter 1, verse 21. And then the tribes of Joseph attack Bethel, and they let a man live who could, for betraying Bethel rather than trusting the Lord. They try to have a man betray Bethel, and he does that, and then they let him live. And then that man rebuilds the city of Luz elsewhere. And this shows that their compromise prevents God's judgment and punishment on the Canaanites. Then in verse 27 to 36 of chapter 1, there's a short description of the other tribes, that they fail to drive out the Canaanites from their cities, and they make them bond servants instead. So instead of acting as God's instrument of punishment, they conquer for their own benefit. They get bond servants and so on, instead of punishing the enemies of God. And this ends up with punishment speech of the angel of the Lord, who comes in Judges 2, verse 1 to 5. Then the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I led you up from Egypt and brought you to the land of which I swore to your fathers, and I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their gods shall be a snare to you. So it was when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the children of Israel that the people lifted up their voices and wept. Then they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. Now we should note here that the angel of the Lord said, I have brought you up, and I will never break my covenant with you. So the angel of the Lord here also shows himself to be the Lord himself, as he has done so many times before. So he's the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, who is called the angel of the Lord so many places in the Old Testament, and almost all places one can see that he's really God too. So what he says here is that the Canaanites, that they will remain, and that God will not drive them out before the Israelites, that is God's punishment for Israel's faithlessness, and they are not driving them out. So God leaves them in a way to themselves. He withdraws his help to drive the Canaanites out because they have not driven them out. But then the angel also says that it will not break his covenant despite this. So eventually he will fulfill his covenant. The covenant he made with Abraham and the fathers, of course. Because that's what has been told to the Israelites also in Deuteronomy, that when all the curses of the law has come upon them, God will remember his covenant with the fathers, that is with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now follows the theological introduction, which speaks about the same events, but also includes in a way really the entire book of Judges in this description of the events. It speaks about the real causation, the real cause and effect relationship here. And it tells us that the next generation after those who had heard Joshua fall away from the Lord and worship the Baals, the idols of the Canaanites. And then the anger of the Lord comes upon them, and the hand of the Lord is against them, and he gives them over to their enemies. And then the Lord raises up judges to save them when they cry to the Lord. And then when the judge dies, they fall away again, and they become worse than their fathers. And then the anger of the Lord comes upon them again. And it explains that God left a number of people after the death of Joshua in order to test the Israelites. But instead of driving those away, they let them live, and they intermarry with them and start worshipping their gods. And that is the reason why they fall away and worship the false gods, and this cycle of God handing them over to the enemies and raising up judges starts. That because they start intermarrying with them and worshipping their gods. Now this description is then unfolded with 12 judges. Only 6 of them are described in details, but 12 judges, which perhaps symbolize the 12 tribes of Israel. But only 6 are described in detail, and of those 6, the first 6 are better, and the last 6 are worse. So we see that this idea that they become worse than their fathers also happens with the judges. Even the judges that God raises up becomes worse and worse eventually. The first one is Othniel, who is son-in-law of Caleb of Judah. The Israelites apostatized, and God gave them into the hands of the Arameans for 8 years. And then Israel cries out to the Lord. And Othniel is called by the Lord, and the Spirit of God comes upon him. He defeats the Aramean king, and the country then has peace for 40 years. Then after Othniel, the Israelites again do what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. They start worshipping false gods, and they are given then into the hands of the Moabite king Eglon and the Amalekites and the Ammonites. And again Israel cries out to the Lord, and Ehud from the tribe of Benjamin appears, and he kills the Moabite king Eglon and defeats the Moabites. And then the land has rest for 80 years. And this having rest is what has been described also in Deuteronomy and the Pentateuch, that's what God will grant them on when they obey him. But this is not a final rest, because as soon as the judge has died, they fall away again. Then Shamgar is described in just one verse, chapter 3, verse 31, who saves them from the Philistines. Then The third of the big judges is described in chapter 4, verse 1 to chapter 5, verse 31, and that's really two judges, or one judge and a general. It's Deborah, the judge and prophetess, and Barak, the general. Israel has fallen away from God again, and God gives them into the hand of the Canaanite king Jabin and his army commander Sisera. And Israel cries out to the Lord. And then we'll learn about the prophetess Deborah, who is a judge and prophesies that God will give Sisera into the hand of Barak. But Barak wants Deborah to go with him. And this cowardice of the general Barak is probably also the background for the fact that we have here a woman who is both a prophet and a judge. We do see in the book of Judges how women are sometimes more courageous than the men, and that is perhaps also because of the idolatry there. So God raises up a female prophetess because there's no men who has the courage to be raised up as a prophet and a judge at this time. So we can't use this to say that in general that women preachers or leaders in the church are a good thing. Deborah then prophesies that God will give Sisera into the hand of a woman because Barak is a coward and wants Deborah to go with him. Now Barak defeats Sisera's army as prophesied, but Sisera is then killed by the Kenite Heber's wife Jael, who lures him into her tent and then kills him. Then Jabin is defeated, and in chapter 5 there is this long song, the song, Deborah's song of victory, and the theme there is that God is a hero that conquers the enemies. And this song is also part of the background of also the song of Mary the Magnificat. The country then rested for 40 years, or had rest in the land for 40 years. So as a result of their obedience and God having granted them a judge, they didn't have rest again for 40 years. Then after the death of Deborah and Barak, the Israelites did evil, and they were given into the hands of the Midianites in chapter 6, verse 1. And this is the story of Gideon. And we see here that even the judges become worse, starting with Gideon. Israel cries out to the Lord, and a prophet reminds them of their sin in chapter 6, verse 7 to 10. But nevertheless, God calls Gideon. He's called by the angel of the Lord, who is the Lord himself, and he proves who he is by letting fire consume Gideon's sacrifice to him. So the angel of the Lord again shows that he is really God himself. God commands Gideon to destroy his father's idol altar and his Asherah idol, and he does this at night while the people do not see it, and we already here see less courage than one would expect. And the people assemble in the morning, and they want to punish him, but he's spared. But then after that, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the people of the east attack Israel, and the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Gideon. And we see this, that the Spirit of the Lord comes upon these judges and gives them strength to destroy the enemies of Israel. Gideon, however, doubts and asks God for 2 signs, and God gives these signs. and this strengthens his faith. We should not see this as some kind of example that we are to imitate, that we can ask for a sign of the man, the sign of God. First, Gideon is not asking for a sign on what to do. So it's not some kind of divination here. And second, this is not an expression of Gideon's faith, but of his doubt, even though God grants it in this case. And we see this doubt of Gideon all through the story of Gideon. And also it ends up with something that looks like divination. God will not let Israel take the glory for conquering the Midianites and the Amalekites and so on. So only 300 men are allowed to fight, and God sorts them by how they drink water. God lets Gideon hear the Midianites talk about. God then lets Gideon hear the Midianites talk about a dream that they have had about being given into the hand of Gideon, again to strengthen Gideon's faith. And Gideon, after that, drives them away with 300 men. And the rest of the Midianites are overcome. Then Gideon is asked if he will rule Israel. That really means if he will be a king, and he refuses that. However, he does get an ephod made, which is used for divination or some kind of idolatry. And he has many wives, and his son is called Abimelech, which means my father is a king. So there's something that shows that Gideon starts to think about himself as a king and as one of these heathen kings that can take many wives against the law of Moses. So Gideon is a turning point where even the judges start to be problematic in how they approach their judging Israel. And then there's a story about Abimelech, who is really, in a sense, the first king of Israel. He's a self-proclaimed king and what we could call an anti-judge, who is a result of Gideon's failures. After Gideon's death, Israel falls away from the Lord again. And Abimelech, the son of Gideon, kills his 7 brothers except Jotham, who flees. And Abimelech allows himself to be proclaimed king by the citizens of Shechem. But God doesn't want this, and he sows some discord between Shechem and Abimelech. Abimelech therefore attacks Shechem and then kills women and children in Shechem's fortress, and he attacks and captures the city of Thebes. But then when he wants to burn the fortress where the rest are, he is hit by a millstone that a woman throws down, and then he's killed by his servant. So we see here how God arranges things so that his enemies are destroyed. Then 2 judges are named. I mentioned Tola in chapter 10, verse 1-2, and Jair in 10, 3-5. There's no detailed description of those, except that Jair has many sons who rode on donkeys. So we again see this tendency to be more kingly and rule in a way reminiscent of the heathens. Then there's the story of Jephthah, another judge. Israel does evil again, and the Ammonites, the descendants of Lot, together with the Philistines, oppress Israel. They oppress the east of Jordan for 18 years, but then they also attack Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim in chapter 10, verse 9. God again admonishes and reminds the Israelites of their sins, and they remove their false gods. Jephthah, who was the son of a harlot, has been chased away and is followed by some outcasts. But he is then brought back and made the head of the Israelites. So he is not in the same way as the former judges chosen by God, or not described that way first. Jephthah first writes to the Ammonites and refused the claim that Israel had taken the land of the Ammonites, as they have been claiming as an excuse for attacking them. And he goes back in history and shows that they did not take the land of Ammonites when they came out of Egypt. But the Lord sends his spirit upon Jephthah nevertheless. But Jephthah makes a promise to sacrifice the first thing that meets him on his way home if he wins. And we see this again as some kind of divination and an attempt to negotiate with God, which is pagan in origin. And God therefore does not respond to this. He does not need this kind of pagan negotiation in order to do what he wants. But when Jephthah has won all the Ammonites, Jephthah's daughter is the first one to come out and meet him. Now, human sacrifice was forbidden, and that was one of the reasons why the Canaanites were to be destroyed. But Jephthah, who here makes an attempt to manipulate and negotiate with God, seems to have ended up sacrificing his daughter because of this promise that was against the law of the Lord. And this should not be seen as an example to follow or as something condoned by Scripture. Rather, this is a sign of this canonization of Israel, that the judges become worse and worse. First, with his attempted negotiation with God, which is really kind of divination, just like we saw in Gideon with the effort, and perhaps already an attempt at that when he asked for these signs from God, which God granted him. But we see this tendency in his heart, and it's the same we see with Jephthah here. We also see a beginning discord among the Israelites, because there's been a war with Ephraim, where because and in this war with Ephraim, because of disagreements about the war with the Ammonites, the Ephraimites are driven away, and those who then say Shibboleth are killed instead of Shibboleth. That's where that is from, that idea of Shibboleth. Jephthah is a judge in 6 years, and then 3 judges are mentioned after that, with no details: Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon, except that Ibzan and Abdon had many sons. So there we also see these kingly tendencies. Now, the last judge mentioned in the book of Judges is Samson. And we see how everything gets worse with him too. The angel of the Lord, who is God himself, appears already at Samson's before Samson is born, and he promises the parents of Samson, who were childless, that they will be that they will have a son. So this is a kind of a miraculous birth, and they also told that Samson must be a Nazarite from birth. That is, he cannot drink alcohol and cut his hair and touch dead bodies and so on. The angel of the Lord here is called Wonderful, and Manoah, the father of Samson, says that he has seen God himself. So we see the Son of God here, and we see a miraculous birth that is in some way a type of the birth of Christ. But also this, that he must be clean in a certain way from his birth. But we also see how all of this disappoints when Samson is born and becomes a judge. Because Samson marries a Philistine woman from Timnah against the will of his parents. So he from the outset does what God has commanded not to do. And then he tells a riddle at the wedding, and the Philistine woman gets the answer out of Samson and tells it to the men of her city. And Samson, as a reaction to this, kills 30 men. So he is an angry man. And this follows Samson too, that he easily becomes angry. The woman is then given to another. And then Samson visits the Philistines. He wants to visit his Philistine wife, but he finds out that he has been given to this other man. And Samson therefore burns the fields of the Philistines. And the Philistines become angry and they want to attack Israel. And Samson is then handed over to the Philistines. But the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him and he kills 1,000 men with the jaws of an ass. After that, we learn that he visits a prostitute, and then he falls in love with the woman Delilah, who is bribed by the Philistine princess to betray him. After several attempts, she gets out of him that his power is in his hair. Perhaps he said that because he remembered the Nazarite promise. She cuts his hair and he loses his strength after that. And then he is taken by the Philistines and his eyes are put out and he is placed between two pillars in the Philistine land and at a party there with the Philistines. He has now been humbled by his own lust, but he ends up repenting and asking God for help, and he kills the Philistines by taking down these pillars that he is tied to. Samson was a Nazarite from birth, and therefore he was supposed to be holy, but he disobeys parents and he is controlled by lust and tempter. He breaks his Nazarite vow by touching corpses, drinking wine, and finally having his hair cut. So we see here that God, with the last judge here, tries to do everything so that he can be pure and holy already from birth. He's born with a miraculous birth, and he's to be a Nazarite from birth, but he is really worse than most of the judges before him. So these are the 12 judges mentioned, but then at the end of the book of Judges, we have two stories of Levites, and both of them are connected to Bethlehem. The first is about the relationship with God, and the second is about the relationship between the tribes and about sexual immorality. The first is about the tribe of Dan. There's a man in Ephraim who gets a house guard made and hires a Levite from Bethlehem as a priest. The tribe of Dan, who have not been able to drive the Canaanites out of their inheritance, they seek another place where they can live, and they pass by this house of worship of this man called Micah, and they take the house guard with them and the Levitical priest with them. They then take the place called Laish, destroys it, and builds up the city called Dan. So here we see very clear idolatry in the tribe of Dan. And we should mark the connection to Bethlehem too, because Bethlehem becomes more and more important here at the end of Judges and also in Ruth. Then the other story of a Levite here is about a Levite who lives in the hill country of Ephraim and takes a wife from Bethlehem. She becomes angry with him and goes to her father's house in Bethlehem. And the Levite goes to Bethlehem to get his wife back. His father-in-law keeps him for several days, but he finally leaves. But it's already afternoon, so he has to stop. And he stops. He goes by Jerusalem, where the Jebusites are, because he don't want to go in there and be in danger among the Canaanites in Jerusalem. So he stops at Gibeah, which is in Benjamin, and an old man from the hill country of Ephraim invites them in. But then the house is surrounded by the men of the city, just like Lot's house in the land of in the city of Sodom, and they want to have the man and commit sodomy with him. It ends with the Levite's wife being brought out, and she is raped and dying. And the Levite brings her home and cuts her in 12 pieces and sends her to the tribes of Israel. And then the tribes of Israel are united, but they're united against Benjamin, as they have been united before against some of the Canaanites. So this is really a holy war, just like the war against the Canaanites, but this is a holy war against one of their own tribes, the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin will not hand over the criminals, and therefore they are attacked. Judah is first sent from Bethel at the command of the Lord. And after an initial defeat, the Israelites seek the Lord, and after that they defeat Benjamin. Benjamin is almost exterminated, but those who remain give the daughters of those who did not go up against Benjamin to the remnant of Benjamin, and let them also take girls from Shiloh who they can rob, but they cannot give them to them because they had promised not to give their daughters to Benjamin after what happened. So we learn from the book of Judges how God has blessed Israel, and he tests their faith by commanding them to drive out the Canaanites, and he promises to be with them. They do not trust God, and therefore the Canaanites become a snare to them. This shows the unbelief in the human heart, and the lack of trust in God, and instead trust in one's own abilities. Then as a result of this, their hearts are turned to idolatry as a result of living with the Canaanites. And God hands them over to alien powers. Israel then repents, and God sends judges. The first judges are good, but they become worse and worse. And Gideon is a turning point with his demand for signs and his and his divination. And his son Abimelech is even worse. Then there's Jephthah, who sacrifices his daughter, just like the Canaanites sacrificed their children to their gods. And he does that in an attempt to negotiate with God. And finally, we have Samson, who is hot-tempered and sins against his Nazarite vow and allows himself to be ruled by his lust. It ends with idolatry in Dan and sodomy in Benjamin and a civil war. And then finally, the book of Judges mentions that there was no king in the time of the judges, and everyone did what they think is good. And this is the reason to also look at the book of Ruth. This is presumably written by Samuel, like the book of Judges, and occasionally it's seen as an addendum to the book of Judges. This marks a transition to the books of Samuel on their account of how David became king. It's also a response to the book of Judges and the problem posed by the book of Judges that there was no king in Israel and everyone did what they thought was good. This is seen as the problem of the book of Judges, the problem of the Israelites. And there's also a kind of an irony that this book of Ruth describes the solution, because it begins with disobedience, and it begins with foreign wives, and it ends up with those foreign wives, or one of those foreign wives joining Israel and becoming a believer in the God of Israel. So there's really a reverse movement here as compared to the book of Judges. Now it begins with the disobedience of a man from Bethlehem in Judah, Elimelech. And here we see the connection to Bethlehem, just like the Levites at the end of the book of Judges. There's a famine due to the sin of Judah, and that's why he leaves Judah and goes to Moab. Instead of trusting God's promises, Elimelech goes to Moab, the place that Israel left when they crossed Jordan and went into the Holy Land. So there is a subtle denial of God's promises about the blessing in the land here. And also it says something about sin, because this famine must be due to the sin of Judah, because it's one of the curses of the law. He then has his sons marry Moabites contrary to the commandments of the law. And it was Moabite women that had led Israel away from the faith in God before they went over Jordan. So he's going back on the other side of Jordan, and he has his sons marry Moabite women, women from the same nation that had led Israel astray when Israel was there. As a consequence, Elimelech and his 2 sons die, and we might see this as a punishment of the Lord for disobeying the commandments. This leaves Naomi, Elimelech's widow, and Orpah and Ruth, the daughters-in-law of Elimelech and widows of his 2 sons. Naomi hears then that the Lord has taken care of her people again in Bethlehem, and she wants to return home. But he asks his daughters-in-law to return to their families too. Orpah does that, but Ruth wants to follow her, and she says, among other things, "Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." So she wants to be part of the people of Israel, and she wants to have their God as her God. She does the opposite of what many of the Israelites did when they intermarried with the Canaanites and started worshiping their gods. She, even after her husband has died, wants to join the people of Israel and believe in their God. So she and Naomi returns to Bethlehem, and Ruth goes then out to gather grain according to the rules for this in the law of Moses, that she could follow the people who are harvesting and take what is not harvested. And there she meets Boaz, who is Elimelech's relative and one that can be a kinsman redeemer. Boaz shows kindness to her after hearing of her faithfulness to her mother-in-law and to her people. Ruth then tells Naomi about Boaz, and Naomi tells her that he is a redeemer, that is a kinsman redeemer, according to the rules of the Mosaic law. And this kinsman redeemer is really a combination of the marriage with a brother-in-law described in Leviticus 25:25 and the kinsman redeemer in Deuteronomy 25:5. And Leviticus 25:25 it says, "If one of your brethren becomes poor and has sold some of his possession, and if his redeeming relative comes to redeem it, then he may redeem what his brother sold." And Deuteronomy 25:5, "If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside of the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her." It seems though that what they want Boaz to do here goes beyond what is strictly required by the law, because he's not a brother he's not a son of Elimelech, and therefore not a brother to Ruth's former husband. Now Naomi advises Ruth to go and lie down at Boaz's feet and really propose to him. Ruth does that and mentions that Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, and Boaz is interested, but there's someone who is closer in relation and therefore has the right to redeem first. Boaz gives some grain to Naomi, and then he finds the other kinsman redeemer and asks him if he wants to redeem. And first he wants to do that, but then Boaz says that Ruth will come, will also then have to be married with him. And then he will not do it anyway, because that will damage his property, because then his firstborn son would be from Ruth would be named after Elimelech's son. So therefore, Boaz ends up buying the property or redeeming the property and marries Ruth. And then at the end of the book of Ruth, we have a family tree. Says that they have a son Obed, who becomes the father of Jesse, the father of David, and thus also the ancestor of Jesus. And then it ends with a genealogy from Perez to David, which shows the connection to both Judah and David. We learn here about the kinsman redeemer, which is a type of Christ. He must be a relative, just like Christ was incarnate and became one of our brothers, became our brother. He must be able to redeem, have the money to redeem, just like Christ had to have the merit to redeem us. He must be willing, just as Mary sacrificed himself willingly, and he must also be willing to marry the widow, just like Christ married the church and gave all he had to the church. We also here learn about this ironic situation that the book of Judges is about Israel mixing with the pagans and worshiping their idols, and that is their downfall. But here a Jew is punished for leaving the land, but his pagan daughter-in-law repents and returns to the land and becomes a part of Israel. She is very much like Rahab, who also joined Israel, and shows that God's punishment of the Moabites and the Canaanites was not so much about ethnicity as it was about their idolatry. God shows his grace also to Gentiles who repent and want to be part of the people of Israel. Now, eventually, there's no solution to the problem of sin in the Old Testament. We see that the problem of sin is demonstrated throughout the book of Judges, that God raises up judges and he puts his spirit upon them, but it doesn't solve the problem there. And even the judges that God puts his spirit upon become worse and worse. The judges could not change Israel's heart, and rather the hearts of the judges became worse and worse, in spite of God putting his spirit upon them. It shows that even with God's law, God's discipline, and God's blessing and his spirit, the law could not be fulfilled. A redeemer and a king is needed. And the book of Ruth suggests the solution. And also the end of the book of Judges, which speaks about the lack of a king. But the rest of the story of the Old Testament will show that a purely human king will not be able to solve the problem either. But we see throughout the Old Testament that these solutions are proposed, and they are given the possibility of showing whether they can solve the problem. And the solutions are types of Christ, but also the fact that they do not succeed is something that shows what is really needed, that it is someone who is both God and man. So we see judges, kings, and prophets who are images of Christ, but also by their fall, they are evidence that people cannot remove sin from the heart themselves. The book of Judges shows the decline of Israel after Joshua. It ends in idolatry and sodomy, just like the Canaanites, whom they had been given the land in order to punish. But they let them live, and the Canaanite worldview creeps in. The solution is a righteous king. God prepares that through a pagan widow of an apostate Israelite who comes to Bethlehem in order to become an Israelite and in the lineage of Judah. And with this, God also prepared the coming of Jesus from Ruth's family. Amen.